I was with a group of individuals, and seems we had an objective. We were to breach this fortress and defeat all the various critters and beasties that lay within. We wound our way through forestry and winding pathways, elevated high above the ground to a mighty iron door. It wasn't as simple as breaking our way in or knocking, nothing quite so mundane. The entrance had a complicated mechanical, technological locking mechanism. It seemed I had the ability or the knowledge to overcome this obstacle that this locking mechanism represented, and so I did. We entered and wound our way through the corridors, passageways of the fortress, battling with monsters and creatures. During our monster fighting activities, I didn't give much consideration as to what we were doing, but suddenly had concerns that I wasn't performing to the extent that the others were, that my efforts were rather lacking in comparison. This seemed of no concern to the others of my monster battling group, but the nagging issue of my underperforming stayed with me, to the point where enough focus on this had my bringing an end to this particular adventure. Seems I not only had the ability to enter this place, but to cease the adventure at any point I so chose, and this personal self-concern effectively brought an end to our escapade. A few of the others in my group were most displeased at my decision, but nevertheless I was no longer in the fortress. I was no longer with the same group, but with another, and the place we were in now was still connected, still a part of the fortress adventure in some way or another. Except now we were not battling monsters. We were very much the recipients of circumstances. We were jumping from scene to scene. I tried to keep count of them, that perhaps their number may prove significant, but alas, the contents of the scenes proved a little too distracting. I would say we transitioned through at least a dozen scenes. Each scene seemed to be almost a trial of a kind. Again, I cannot recall them all, only really the themes. A few I would bring back with me when I awoke. Some scenes were of great disasters, like volcanic eruptions, the ground fragmenting beneath our feet. Others were of scenes with creatures assailing us. In one scene, we were accosted by giant robotic monstrosities. In another dream, we were all bound in a horrific laboratory, and in the adjacent room we could expect to receive torture and death at the hands of these less than sane scientific types. All the scenes ran in a sequence and seemed to escalate in their intensity and hardship. And interestingly, the scenes didn't simply transition of their own accord. It was left to us to skip to the next scene, to escape whatever horror, be it creature or environmental, that featured in each. Seems the individuals in my group had varied ability to translocate the entire group from each scene. Always when we translocated, we found ourselves in the next scene, each scene more arduous than the last. Some of the group had no ability, or very little ability in translocating us. Some had a degree, but it seems I had the most. I'd experienced this means of motion before, and had utilized it on various experiences. Some I have recounted before, where I would build up tremendous energy within my being, picture somewhere, and to that location I would go. As the scenes escalated in their nature, this seemed to make it far harder to activate this ability, almost as though the personal self were becoming too embroiled, and with immersion with it, consequently the ability was lost. Those with the least skill becoming ineffective first, so it would fall to others with greater ability, or ability to keep the personal self from involving itself, to take over the group translocation. Eventually, the scenes became intense to the degree that it was left to me to secure the group's safety. About halfway through all the unfolding scenes, I would say. Each time we entered another unsavory scene, I would immediately draw my energy, but seems we had to endure these trials. So instead of picturing a place of safety beyond, always a tear would open in the very fabric of our vicinity, and suddenly the current scene would fade from sight, and into the next one we would go. It was becoming harder to do this, as the situations were becoming more and more abrasive, to the point that I was just managing to whisk my group to the next scene in time, before we fell to whatever was attacking or bombarding us in the current one. Finally, we reached the final scene, and with one final tumultuous effort, I got the group clear, and we all floated from the fortress that encased these curious trials. As I would take one last glance over my shoulder, I would see a sign chained across the fortress door. it proclaimed the fortress to be shut down until further notice, as though suggesting it served this very purpose and would do again at some future moment. So we have initially what seemed to be some kind of decided upon battle, monsters and creatures within a fortress. I had the sense that my group were individuals of an aware nature, maybe a few guides too. And so this excursion was one of awareness-enhancing necessity, and so there was more to it than met the literal senses. Quite likely, we were battling and destroying creatures that were perhaps representative of aspects of our created consciousnesses, our attitudes, agreements, and attachments, our old, outdated ideas, perhaps still lingering in our causal vehicles from lifetimes long ago lived. In other words, we were taking care of old taplines. Seems we then had the ability, the awareness to deal with these taplines ourselves, and so we did, going in with weapons a-flailing, under the watchful eye of the guides amongst our number. We always are the decider of our taplines, choosing what we will cling on to, etc., with the understanding that we must release all these self-agreed and decided upon restrictions if we are to someday stand real with the ears. The fact that the door was locked with complicated technologies rather than simply a normal lock you might expect to see on a mighty iron door was a demonstration of the complexity and how compounded the created consciousness is these days, how programmed subliminally it is. And yes, we always are the decider, and can still enter our fortresses of agreement and attachment taplines and deal with them. But it's a far more difficult decision to begin with. The personal self, finding it perhaps far harder to embark on such a journey to the ears more than ever before in so-called history, due to all the subliminals, the fear and the weight of opposition to this undertaking, and the fact that the bolting mechanism was technological too, suggested how much of the resistance stems from technological sources, the black magic of the televisions, computers and mobile phones, etc., or cell phones, I should say. But as was demonstrated here, we still are the deciders of our lives, and on choosing to enter, I simply had the ability to open the lock, open the door, despite the crushing weight of technologically induced subliminal programming resistance. Maybe we are then entering parts of our created consciousness never before addressed, piled under layers of additional consideration, ideas, emotion, and programming. We're getting to some of the more stubborn taplines. So in we go and start to deal with our taplines, slaying the monsters that represent them. We all are at different stages in our awareness process and ought not to compare ourselves to others, judge and look down, etc. We are all on our own journeys and unfolding in the time we require to get it done. But it seems here I allowed a few attitudes to creep in. My personal self, perhaps feeling a little inadequate compared to some of my group that perhaps were far more advanced in their process. We all are free beings of real light, and all that separates us is our awareness. And yet, the personal self will have its notions of insecurity at times. And even though, yes, this group was at different stages of awareness, we all were working together. We all were supporting each other, irrespective of this. And yet, my personal self was kicking up a created attitude, and as a result, this terminated the adventure. Seems to be most effective in such a tapline removing operation requires that as much as possible we keep the personal self at bay, its attitudes and silliness, which can only waylay, or in this case bring a halt to proceedings. But maybe add a few more taplining, emotionally charged ideas into the mix. Again, we are the decider of everything, what we release tapline-wise or cling onto, and effectively, my assuming this attitude of inadequacy was tantamount to deciding not to proceed, and so endeth the tapline clearing. It's possible the rest of the group remained and proceeded on, as I found myself no longer with them. As we can support others, but we cannot go against what they decide. Those who were displeased at me, I suggest, were perhaps the guides, quite possibly Rebazar. He has quite a distinctive presence about him that you come to recognize. I would say it is like the school teachers who see the potentials of their students and want them to succeed, and perhaps get a little exasperated when they fall a little short at times. And Dwayne has said that the guides can be a little forward in their ways, as he allows them to do so. And then I find myself in a new place, a kind of testing ground, with all the scenes that are trials of a kind. I was with a new group of aware type individuals, but not as aware as those I was with in the fortress. Indeed, my awareness superseded theirs, as those in the fortress superseded mine. Interestingly, how the notion of engaging the scenes, of battling with them, didn't seem to feature, sometimes being embroiled in creational ideas that battles represent, do have us the effects of them as we become involved in the duality and remove ourselves from our objective standing in the new nowness state of being, and we can even forfeit our journey of is recognition if we become engaged with the battles the controllers create and litter our paths with, distractions designed to snare people in the creational matrix and claim their focus. Also, I have found that if my personal self comes to bear, I am reduced in my connection to my real awareness and real self, and consequently, my ability to deal with situations and individuals on the real side is diminished. So here I maybe recognized this temporary lack of ability due to my prior fortress attitude, and I'd rendered myself less adept at situation handling. Nevertheless, I had the ability to translocate myself, something I've been always able to do on the real side before I came to find the new presentation. Back then, I would have then the ability in what I'd call the dream arena, or during my astral projections. My ability now seemed extended to being able to translocate entire groups, and the responsibility fell on my shoulders to do so, but not taking them beyond these nightmarish trials, as though I knew, my real self knew, my group and I was to endure them all. I would simply say the reason for this final series of tests was that, since I had ducked out of the tapline removing activity due to my silly personal self, I may as well use the time productively, and this was set up by the guides too. Here I could test my ability to utilize my translocation skill under the duress of greater and greater adversity. For if I succumbed to what was happening, fell completely into my personal little self, I'd be less able to activate the ability, as demonstrated by the others in my group, to be able to translocate when being attacked or in the midst of a volcanic eruption requires that one remain in a state of being isness, connected to the real self, indifferent and objective. So a good practice for this state, especially with what is coming soon on the planet Earth and creation, etc. Maybe the tests were a lesson in that even with a little personal self-interjection, I could still readily switch back into my real self and operate according to my real awareness, and not the personal self, As these situations demanded, I snap back out of my personal self without delay, and the whole translocation ability seems to be a trick that we are constantly practicing on the real side, as it has featured in many of my experiences, something perhaps that may be required at a future time. And so we can see that we are always doing something on the real side, if we're not gathering experiences for objective comparisons by which to recognize the ears. We're removing taplines that restrict us and hinder our awareness. Or maybe we're going through a few trials and tests that we become more adept at handling ourselves, situations, and practice objectivity in the face of adversity. So it seems the trials were maybe a training ground the guides use often, amongst others, and they may well have decided to string that notice upon the entrance as I departed, closed till further notice, to emphasize this point. And that's the end of that one.
Is it time for a commercial break, Kevin? Yes, that was far out. And it's excellent how you explain those and from your astral projection days, you notice that when you used to do astral projection, and many of us have done things like that, it's more along the personal side because that's all we know. And now there's a bigger picture to kind of take a look at, and there's a lot to it. And just like when you were having the experience there, you hesitated, whatever. Ahmad Sarkil has to mute. We come to those points sometimes where we need, it's like it becomes a lot for us, and so we just kind of readjust things. But you're doing it excellent, yes. And so overall, what each person is trying to figure out is how their intent aligns with this true reality, and can have that view and that identity with that, etc. And that's huge. So we go through a lot of these personal things and all these adventures like you're doing because they provide real objectivity. And as I'm listening to you, it's great how you explain this. It's really fun because I constantly see things myself because as we have this personal self here, we're always having to deal with it, and situations are changing all the time, etc. In creation. So what you brought forward, how you explain it, etc. It's just very, very good. So you're doing fine, no matter what the situation or what you think about it. You see, you still have your focus there. You still keep attempting it. So that's all that matters. And most people give up. They do it a little bit. They'll do the new you, they'll have some dream experiences, and they'll just get back to their personal life. They give up. But it's not about that because it's endless. So, yeah, it's terrific what you're doing and sharing with others, sharing with us, too. Thank you.